In the age that followed the departure of the Roman legions, the island of Britain was a fractured and sorrowful land. The light of order had been extinguished, leaving behind a patchwork of petty kingdoms, each ruled by a chieftain or a warlord, whose claim to power was written not in law, but in the sharp, brutal language of the sword. The roads the Romans had built, once symbols of unity and commerce, were crumbling into disuse, becoming pathways for bandits and raiding parties. A deep and pervasive darkness had fallen over the land, a time of chaos and fear, where the memory of a united realm was but a fading dream in the minds of the old. It was a land without a king. Into this turmoil was born a man of singular destiny, though none knew it at the time, Uther Pendragon, a powerful warlord of the Britons, had managed through force of arms and strength of will to forge a semblance of a high kingship. He was a man of great passions and fierce ambition, but his reign was built on a foundation of conflict, and his most profound desire would ultimately sow the seeds of both his own undoing and the land's. Greatest hope. Uther fell into a deep and consuming love for Igraine, the beautiful and virtuous wife of his most powerful rival Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall. This was a love that bordered on madness, a fire that could not be quenched by reason or duty. Seeing the king's obsession, the enigmatic and powerful sorcerer, Merlin, came to Uther with a proposition. Merlin, who was more than a man, was a being who could see the threads of fate that wove through the lives of mortals. He saw a future that desperately needed a great king, a beacon of light to push back the encroaching darkness. He knew that such a king must be born of others' line, yet raised far from the corrupting influence of his court and the bitter enmities his father had created. And so, a grim bargain was struck. Merlin agreed to use his arts to disguise Uther in the likeness of Gorlois, allowing the king to enter the duke's impenetrable fortress of Tintagel and spend one night with Igraine. In return, Uther had to swear a solemn oath. The child born of that union would be surrendered to Merlin at the moment of its birth, to be raised as the sorcerer saw fit, with no questions asked. Blinded by his passion, Uther agreed. That very night, as Uther in the guise of Gorlois was with Igraine, the true duke was slain in a skirmish outside the castle walls. The deception was complete, and in time Igraine, now Uther's wife, gave birth to a son. The moment the child drew his first breath, Merlin appeared, a hooded and silent figure in the shadows of the royal chamber. True to his oath, a heartbroken Uther handed over his only son and heir. Merlin wrapped the infant in a cloth of gold and vanished into the night, leaving no trace of where he had gone or what name he had given the child. The boy, who was named Arthur, was taken to the remote and humble castle of Sir Ector, a loyal and honorable knight of modest means. There Arthur was raised as Ector's own son, alongside his elder foster brother, a boy named Kay. Arthur grew up knowing nothing of his royal blood, learning the ways of a simple squire, how to care for horses, how to polish armor, and how to serve a knight with loyalty and diligence. He was a kind and earnest boy, strong of limb and fair of face, with a quiet humility that set him apart from the proud and often boastful Kay. Years passed. King Uther Pendragon, consumed by grief and weakened by endless wars, eventually died without a known heir. The fragile unity he had imposed upon the land shattered instantly. The warlords and petty kings once again turned on each other, and Britain plunged back into an even deeper state of anarchy and despair. The land cried out for a leader, for a true king who could unite the warring factions and restore peace and justice. It was then that Merlin, after years of silence, chose to act. On a cold Christmas morning, in the churchyard of the greatest cathedral in London, a miracle appeared. Where the ground had been bare the night before, there now stood a great, rough-hewn block of marble. Thrust deep into the stone was a magnificent sword, its hilt richly decorated with gold and jewels. Inscribed upon the stone in gleaming golden letters were these words: "Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England." The news of the miraculous sword spread like wildfire across the land. From every corner of Britain, the strongest and noblest men-kings, dukes, and champions flocked to London, each believing himself to be the one destined to rule. A great tournament was proclaimed for New Year's Day, a gathering of all the knights of the realm, to provide a grand occasion for the contenders to try their hand at drawing the blade. Among those who journeyed to London for the tournament were Sir Ector, his son Sir Kay, who had recently been knighted, and the young Arthur, who served as Kay's squire. They arrived in the bustling city, filled with the sounds of blacksmiths' hammers and the sight of colorful banners fluttering in the winter wind, on the day of the tournament. As they rode towards the jousting fields, Sir Kay suddenly realized, with great frustration, that he had left his sword behind at their lodgings. Ever eager to prove himself, he impatiently ordered his young squire, Arthur, to ride back and fetch it for him. Arthur, ever dutiful, immediately turned his horse and galloped back through the crowded streets. But when he arrived at the inn, he found it locked and empty. Everyone had gone to the tournament. Disappointed and worried that he had failed his brother, Arthur began to ride back, his mind racing for a solution. It was then that he passed the great churchyard. He saw the marble stone, a silent and solitary monument in the deserted square. He saw the hilt of the great sword, gleaming in the pale winter light. He had heard the stories, of course, but being a simple and unassuming boy, he paid them little mind. All he saw was a fine sword, seemingly abandoned and available. It is a pity for so noble a sword to be without a master. He thought to himself, I will borrow it for my brother Kay, and then I shall be sure to return it to its place. Without a thought for the prophecy or the crowd of powerful men who had failed before, Arthur dismounted. He walked to the stone, the thin layer of frost crunching under his boots. He took hold of the ornate hilt. It felt warm and strangely familiar. In his hands he gave a gentle, steady pull. The blade slid from the stone as smoothly and easily as if it were being drawn from a scabbard of silk. There was no resistance, only a soft, singing sound as the steel met the air. Arthur looked at the magnificent weapon in his hand, marveling at its balance and beauty, entirely unaware of the magnitude of his act. He mounted his horse and rode happily back to the tournament, pleased that he had found a sword for his brother. When he presented it to Sir Kay, the young knight immediately recognized it as the sword in the stone. For a moment, ambition flickered in Kay's heart, and he was tempted to claim that he had been the one to draw it. He went to his father, Sir Ector, and showed him the blade. But Sir Ector was a wise and just man. He looked at his son, then at the earnest, innocent face of his foster child, Arthur, and he knew the truth. He led them both back to the churchyard. There, he commanded Kay to place the sword back into the stone. Kay tried, but the sword would not enter. Ector then instructed Arthur to replace it. Arthur did so, and the blade slid back into the marble as if it were returning home. Then Ector commanded Kay to try and draw it once more. Kay pulled with all his might, his face turning red with effort, but the sword did not move an inch. Finally, Ector turned to Arthur. Now you try, he said softly. Arthur, bewildered by all the fuss, once again took the hilt and, with the same effortless grace, drew the sword from the stone dart at that moment. Sir Ector and Sir Kay dropped to their knees before the boy. Arthur was astonished. "Father, brother, why do you kneel to me?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. It was then that Sir Ector revealed the truth as Merlin had told it to him years ago, that Arthur was not his son, but a child of noble birth, given to him for safekeeping. And now it was clear that he was the rightwise king of all Britain. The news of what a mere boy had accomplished sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. At first, they refused to believe it. They were proud and powerful men, and they would not bow to a child of unknown lineage. They shouted in protest, claiming it was some trick of sorcery. To quell the dissent, it was agreed that the sword should be tested again, at another great gathering at Candlemas, and then again at Easter, and finally at Pentecost. Each time, the strongest knights and lords of the realm strained and struggled, their muscles bulging and their faces contorted with effort, but the sword remained immovable, and each time, after all others had failed, Arthur would step forward and draw the blade with an ease that was both miraculous and undeniable. Finally, at the feast of Pentecost, after Arthur had once more drawn the sword before the entire assembly, the common people, who had grown weary of the endless strife and the arrogance of the lords, could no longer contain their support. A great cry went up from the crowd. "We will have Arthur for our king. We will have no more delays, for it is the will of God." They surged forward, their voices a thunderous roar of acceptance, seeing the tide of popular opinion turn so decisively. The reluctant lords and knights at last relented. One by one, they came forward and knelt before the boy who stood holding the sword of prophecy, and they swore their oaths of fealty to him. And so it was that Arthur, the boy who knew himself only as a humble squire, was crowned High King of all Britain. Arthur's ascension to the throne did not magically bring peace to the land. His claim, though proven by the miracle of the sword, was still challenged by a confederation of powerful kings from the north and west. Led by King Lot of Orkney, they saw a boy on the throne and thought him an easy target, a puppet king they could depose to further their own ambitions. They gathered their armies and marched against him. In these early, difficult years, Merlin was Arthur's constant guide and protector. The sorcerer taught the young king the arts of statecraft and the strategies of war. He revealed to Arthur the secret of his royal birth, telling him of Uther and Igraine, a revelation that filled the young king with a sense of profound destiny and a heavy burden of responsibility. With Merlin's counsel and his own innate wisdom and courage, Arthur met the rebellious kings in a series of great battles. He proved himself to be not just a boy with a magic sword, but a brilliant commander and a fearless warrior. He led his knights from the front, inspiring them with his bravery and his unwavering commitment to justice. He treated his defeated enemies with mercy and honor, a quality that was rare in that brutal age, and slowly, through strength and virtue, he won the loyalty of all but his most bitter enemies. After one particularly fierce battle, Arthur's sword, the sword in the stone, was broken. Grieving the loss of the blade that had made him king, he was led by Merlin to the edge of a vast, misty lake. As they stood on the shore, a wondrous sight appeared. An arm, clothed in pure white silk, rose from the center of the lake, its hand holding aloft a magnificent sword, its scabbard encrusted with precious stones. "Behold," said Merlin, "the sword Excalibur, forged in the mystical Isle of Avalon. It is to be yours, if you are worthy." A boat appeared, carrying a beautiful, ethereal woman who introduced herself as the Lady of the Lake. She offered the sword to Arthur, telling him that its blade was so sharp it could cut through iron, but that its scabbard was even more valuable, for whoever wore it would never lose a drop of blood. no matter how grievously they were wounded. Arthur took Excalibur and its scabbard with a sense of profound awe, understanding that he was a custodian of powers beyond the mortal realm, with the land finally at peace and his rule secure. Arthur set about building his kingdom. He chose for his capital a place called Camelot, and there he built a magnificent castle and a great city, a symbol of the new age of peace and prosperity. It was to be a beacon of light, a place where justice, learning, and chivalry would flourish. It was here that he established his court, and it was here that he chose to take a wife. His heart was captured by the breathtakingly beautiful Princess Guinevere, the daughter of King Leodegrance. Merlin, with his foresight, warned Arthur against the match, telling him that Guinevere's beauty would bring with it great joy, but also a sorrow that would ultimately lead to the ruin of the kingdom. But Arthur, young and in love, chose to follow his heart. He married Guinevere in a grand ceremony, and the people rejoiced. For their queen was as gracious and noble as their king was brave and just got as a wedding gift. King Leodegrance gave Arthur a magnificent and significant present, a huge round table, so large it could seat 150 knights. This was the very table that Uther Pendragon had once commissioned. Arthur was overjoyed, for the table represented the very ideal upon which he wished to build his new order of knights. He decreed that henceforth his greatest warriors would be known as the Knights of the Round Table. The table's shape was symbolic. At a round table there is no head, and no man is seated in a position of greater importance than another. All who sat there were to be considered equals, a brotherhood bound not by rank, but by a shared oath. This oath, which every knight had to swear, was the foundation of the chivalric code that would make Camelot famous throughout the world. They swore to never commit outrage or murder, to always flee from treason, to give mercy unto him that asketh mercy, to always give aid to ladies, damsels, and gentlewomen, and to never take up a battle in a wrongful quarrel, for love or for worldly goods. The greatest knights of the age flocked to Camelot to join this noble fellowship. There was the valiant Sir Gawain, Arthur's loyal nephew, a man whose strength waxed and waned with the sun. There was the wise Sir Bedivere, the pious Sir Bors, and the pure-hearted Sir Percival. But the greatest of them all, the most skilled in arms and the most perfect in courtesy, was a knight from across the sea in France, Sir Lancelot du Lac. From the moment Lancelot arrived at court, he was hailed as the paragon of knighthood. His prowess in the tournament field was unmatched, and his bravery in battle was legendary. He and King Arthur formed a deep and powerful friendship, a bond of mutual respect and admiration. Lancelot became the king's champion and his most trusted friend, and it was this profound bond that made the tragedy that followed all the more devastating. For Lancelot, upon first seeing Queen Guinevere, fell deeply and irrevocably in love with her, and she, seeing in him the embodiment of all that was noble and valiant, returned that love with an equal passion. For many years their love remained a secret, a tormented and unspoken devotion that they both fought to suppress out of loyalty and love for Arthur. It was a noble, courtly love, but it was also a flaw in the perfect fabric of Camelot, a crack in the foundation that would, in time, widen and bring the whole glorious edifice crashing down. For a long time, however, these were golden years. The Knights of the Round Table rode out from Camelot on countless quests, righting wrongs, slaying monsters, overthrowing tyrants, and rescuing the oppressed. They brought Arthur's law and justice to the furthest corners of the realm. The land prospered as never before. It was a time of peace, a brief, shining moment in history that would be remembered forever as the Golden Age of Camelot. but perfection, once achieved, is a difficult thing to maintain. A strange sense of restlessness began to creep into the court. With all earthly evils seemingly vanquished, the knights began to yearn for a higher, more spiritual purpose. This yearning found its focus in the legend of the Holy Grail, the cup from which Christ was said to have drunk at the Last Supper, and which was believed to have been brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea. It was said to possess miraculous powers and could only be seen by the purest of heart. One evening, during a great feast at Camelot, a vision of the Grail, veiled in white silk, appeared in the hall, filling the room with a heavenly light and a beautiful scent. It passed among the knights and then vanished. Struck with awe, Sir Gawain was the first to rise and vow that he would ride forth for a year and a day on a quest to find the Grail and gaze upon it unveiled. One by one, almost all the knights of the Round Table followed his lead, making the same solemn vow. King Arthur was filled with a deep sense of foreboding. He knew that this quest was not for all of them, and that most were not worthy to achieve it. He lamented, "I am sure that this quest will be the end of the Round Table, for you will never all meet again in this hall." His words were prophetic. The quest for the Holy Grail marked the beginning of the end for the fellowship. Many of the knights who rode out were never seen again, slain in their travels or lost in their spiritual wanderings. The quest demanded a spiritual purity that few of them possessed. Lancelot, the greatest of earthly knights, desperately sought the Grail, hoping that achieving it would cleanse him of the sin of his love for Guinevere. But his heart was divided, and he was granted only a brief, clouded vision of the sacred vessel before being struck down and cast out, forced to confront the fact that his worldly perfection was a barrier to heavenly grace. In the end, the Grail was achieved by only 3 knights: the steadfast Sir Bors, the gentle Sir Percival, and, greatest of them all, Sir Galahad, the illegitimate son of Lancelot. Galahad was a youth of unparalleled purity and holiness, the knight for whom the legendary Siege Perilous, the one empty seat at the Round Table, had been reserved, after finding the Grail. Galahad's spiritual journey was complete, and his soul was taken up into heaven. The Holy Grail vanished from the mortal world forever. The quest was over, and the few knights who survived, weary and disillusioned, made their way back to a Camelot that was now a shadow of its former self. The unity of the Round Table was broken, its numbers depleted, and its spirit diminished. The Golden Age was drawing to a close. With the end of the Grail quest, a melancholy mood settled over Camelot. The high sense of purpose was gone, replaced by an awareness of their own imperfections. The secret love between Lancelot and Guinevere, which had been a source of private torment for years, now became a source of public suspicion. Though they tried to be discreet, their deep affection for one another was plain for all to see, and it became a subject of whispers and jealous murmurs in the darker corners of the court. This simmering discontent was fanned into a flame by those who had long been jealous of Lancelot's fame and Arthur's power. Chief among them were Sir Agravaine, Gawain's bitter and spiteful brother, and Sir Mordred. Mordred was a knight of dark and twisted ambition, but his claim to power had a venomous legitimacy. He was the illegitimate son of King Arthur himself, born of an unwitting and incestuous union with his half-sister, Morgause, long before Arthur was king. Mordred hated his father for the shame of his birth and saw in the Queen's affair a perfect weapon to destroy everything Arthur held dear. Together, Agravaine and Mordred began to poison the court with their accusations, insisting that Lancelot and Guinevere were traitors who dishonored the king and the entire realm. They brought their charges before Arthur. The king, who loved both his wife and his best friend dearly, was tormented. He refused to believe the accusations without proof, yet the law he himself had established demanded that he act. Bound by his own code of justice, he reluctantly agreed to a plan proposed by Mordred to lay a trap for the lovers. Arthur announced that he would be going on a hunting trip and would be away from the castle all night. Lancelot, believing the king to be gone, was summoned to the queen's chambers. It was a trap. As soon as he arrived, Mordred, Gawain, and a dozen other knights burst from their hiding places, shouting accusations of treason. Though unarmed and unarmored, Lancelot fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion. He managed to slay Gawain and all but one of the other knights, and then, heartbroken and filled with despair, he fled from Camelot. Mordred, who had been wounded, escaped to spread the news. The affair was now exposed for all to see. Arthur was devastated, his personal grief at war with his public duty as king. The law was absolute. A queen found guilty of adultery was guilty of high treason, and the punishment was to be burned at the stake. With a heavy heart that felt as if it were breaking, King Arthur condemned his beloved Guinevere to death, but Lancelot would not allow it. On the day of the execution, as Guinevere was led to the pyre, he and his followers charged out of the forest where they had been hiding. In the furious battle that followed, Lancelot rescued the queen and carried her away to the safety of his own castle, Joyous-Gard. But the rescue came at a terrible cost. In the chaos of the fight, Lancelot unknowingly killed two of Sir Gawain's younger and most beloved brothers, the unarmed Sir Gareth and Sir Gaurus. When Gawain learned of his brothers' deaths at the hands of the man he had once admired, his grief turned into a white-hot, implacable rage. His love for Lancelot was transformed into a burning hatred, and he swore an oath of vengeance. He went before Arthur and demanded war. Torn between his duty to his nephew and his lingering love for Lancelot, Arthur finally relented. The schism was now complete. The Fellowship of the Round Table was irrevocably shattered, its members forced to choose sides between their king and their former champion. Arthur, at the head of a great army, laid siege to Joyous-Gard, but Lancelot refused to fight his king. He endured the siege, hoping for reconciliation. Eventually, under pressure from the Pope, a fragile peace was negotiated. Guinevere was returned to Arthur, and Lancelot was exiled to his own lands in France. But Gawain's thirst for revenge was not slaked. He relentlessly goaded Arthur, convincing him that honor demanded they pursue Lancelot across the sea and destroy him completely. Leaving Mordred behind as regent to rule in his stead, Arthur took his army and sailed for France to wage war on Lancelot. It was a sad and pointless war between two men who did not want to fight. As Arthur's army besieged Lancelot's city, Gawain would ride out each day and challenge Lancelot to single combat. Lancelot repeatedly refused until he could no longer endure Gawain's insults. They fought, and Lancelot, the superior warrior, easily wounded Gawain but refused to kill him. It was during this tragic and futile conflict that the final blow fell. Word came from Britain that Mordred had betrayed them all. He had forged letters claiming that Arthur had been killed in battle and had declared himself the new High King. He had won the support of many of the people, who were tired of the endless wars, and he was now trying to force Queen Guinevere to marry him. Arthur abandoned his war with Lancelot at once and sailed back to Britain to reclaim his throne. As his army landed at Dover, Mordred's forces were there to meet them. A great and terrible battle was fought on the shore. In the fighting, Sir Gawain, still weak from the wound Lancelot had given him, was struck down and mortally wounded. As he lay dying, his rage finally cooled, and he understood the terrible folly of his quest for vengeance. He wrote a letter to Lancelot, asking for his forgiveness and begging him to come to Arthur's aid. Then Arthur's greatest nephew and one of his first knights died in his arms. The two armies, Arthur's and Mordred's, marched across the blighted land, finally meeting for the last decisive battle on the Salisbury Plain, near Camlan. On the eve of the battle, Arthur had a dream in which the spirit of Gawain appeared to him, warning him not to fight the next day, for if he did, he would surely die. He was told to arrange a truce and wait for Lancelot, who was on his way with his army. The next morning, Arthur and Mordred met between their two armies to sign the treaty. They had each brought 14 of their most trusted men. As a precaution, they had both given their armies the same order. If at any time during the parley a sword was drawn, they were to attack at once. The truce was agreed upon, and for a moment it seemed that the final, catastrophic battle might be averted. But fate would not be denied. As one of Mordred's knights stood in the grass, an adder slithered out and bit him on the heel. The knight, acting on pure instinct, drew his sword to kill the snake. Both armies saw the flash of sunlight on polished steel, believing it to be a signal of betrayal. A great cry went up from both sides. The horns sounded, the banners were raised, and the two armies charged at each other. The dreadful and tragic battle of Camlan had begun. It was a battle of unparalleled savagery, a conflict not for glory or honor, but of pure, nihilistic destruction. Brother fought against brother. And by the end of the day, the field was covered with the dead and the dying. The dream of Camelot perished in a tide of blood and mud. As twilight fell, only a handful of men were left standing. King Arthur, weeping at the ruin of his kingdom and the loss of all his knights, looked across the field of slaughter and saw Mordred, the architect of all his pain, still alive. Filled with a terrible, grief-stricken rage, Arthur took up his spear. The lone surviving knight at his side, Sir Bedivere, begged him to stop, to remember the warning from his dream. But Arthur could not be dissuaded. That traitor shall not escape me, he cried. He charged at Mordred. Mordred, seeing him coming, ran to meet him. Arthur thrust his spear with all his remaining strength, driving it clean through Mordred's body. But Mordred, in a final, dying act of malice, pulled himself up the shaft of the spear and struck Arthur a mortal blow on the head with his own sword, shattering his helmet and cleaving his skull. Mordred fell dead to the ground. King Arthur collapsed beside him, grievously wounded. The battle was over. The Round Table was no more. Sir Bedivere, his heart broken, carried his dying king from the field of death to a small, ruined chapel by a nearby lake. Arthur, his breath coming in shallow gasps, knew his time in the world of men was at an end. He had one final command. He ordered Bedivere to take his sword, Excalibur, and throw it into the waters of the lake. Bedivere took the magnificent sword. But when he saw its jeweled hilt gleaming in the moonlight, he could not bring himself to throw such a treasure away. He hid the sword among some reeds and returned to Arthur, telling him he had done as commanded. "What did you see?" Arthur asked weakly. "I saw nothing but the wind on the water," Bedivere replied. Arthur knew he was lying. "You have betrayed me for the richness of the sword," he whispered. "Go again, and do as I command." Twice more Bedivere went, and twice he failed, his heart unable to part with the beautiful weapon. Each time, Arthur knew he had been disobeyed. Finally, on the third attempt, filled with shame, Bedivere hurled Excalibur with all his might out over the dark, still water. A wondrous thing happened. Before the sword could hit the surface, an arm clothed in white silk rose from the lake, caught the sword by the hilt, brandished it 3 times in the air, and then drew it back down into the depths. Bedivere returned and told Arthur what he had seen. "It is well," Arthur breathed. "Now carry me to the water's edge, for my end is near." When Bedivere carried the king to the shore, a mysterious black barge drifted out of the mist to meet them. On its deck were 3 tall, sorrowful queens, their faces veiled, one of whom was Arthur's half-sister, Morgan le Fay. They gently lifted the king from Bedivere's arms and laid him upon the deck. As the barge began to drift away into the mist, Arthur raised his hand in a final farewell. "I go now," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "to the Vale of Avalon, to be healed of my grievous wound." The barge disappeared into the mists, and Sir Bedivere was left alone on the shore, weeping for the passing of his king and the end of the greatest kingdom the world had ever known. The body of King Arthur was never found, but some say that on his tomb, in the ruins of Glastonbury, were written these words: Hic iacet Arthurus, rex quondam, rex futurus.
The quiet restoration of Folio 74 story.
In the hushed, climate-controlled halls of the county records office, time moved differently. Outside, the city bustled with the noise and rush of the modern world cars, sirens, and the hurried footsteps of people with urgent destinations. But inside the archive, behind heavy, insulated doors, the only sound was the gentle, almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system, a constant, low drone that was the building's own form of silence. The air was cool, dry, and carried the faint, clean scent of old paper, bookbinding leather, and archival-grade conservation materials. It was here that Elias Vance spent his days. He was a man whose movements had, over 30 years of practice, become as quiet and deliberate as his surroundings. He was a senior conservator, a custodian of the past, and his work was a slow, meticulous conversation with time itself. His current project lay before him on his large, brightly lit workbench. It was not a grand or famous document. It was not a royal charter or a celebrated author's manuscript. It was something far more ordinary, and to Elias, far more intimate, a single, disbound folio from a parish ledger dated 1832. This particular page, designated Folio 74, contained a list of baptisms from a small, long-forgotten village on the coast. The names were written in the elegant, looping copperplate script of the period, the ink now faded from black to a soft, sepia brown. The folio was in a fragile state. The paper, made from rag pulp, was brittle at the edges, a common affliction for documents of its age. A dark, spidery bloom of water-damage stained the top right corner, a ghostly memory of a leaky roof a century ago. The left edge, where it had once been stitched into the ledger's binding, was ragged and torn, but the most significant injury was a long, L-shaped tear near the bottom, which ran directly through 2 of the recorded names. Elias's task for the afternoon was to begin the long and patient process of mending that tear. He began, as always, with preparation. He washed his hands thoroughly and then pulled on a pair of thin, white cotton gloves to protect the delicate paper from the oils on his skin. He surveyed his workbench. The surface was a wide expanse of clean, white blotter paper. His tools were ranged to his left in a precise and changing order. A set of bamboo-handled brushes with bristles of varying softness, a row of stainless steel microspatulas, their tips honed to fine, thin edges, a polished bone folder, smooth and cool to the touch, a small, heavy glass weight, and the materials for the repair itself, a small sheet of Japanese tissue paper and a small jar of prepared wheat starch paste. First, he needed to perform a more detailed examination. He switched on the magnifying lamp, a large, circular lens, with a bright, shadowless light, and positioned it over the folio. He leaned in, his breathing slow and even. Under magnification, the landscape of the paper became a geography of hills and valleys. He could see the individual fibers of the rag pulp, the way the iron gall ink had bitten into the surface, and the crystalline residue left by the evaporated water and the damaged corner. He made notes in a separate logbook, his handwriting small and neat. Folio 74, Parish of St. Giles by the Sea. Dimensions 280 mm by 420 mm. Condition: significant foxing on lower third. Water damage: stable, upper right quadrant. Ragged binding edge. L-shaped tear, approx. 90 mm by 35 mm. Located lower left. Paper is brittle but retains some flexibility. The examination complete, the first stage of the physical work could begin: surface cleaning. This was perhaps the most delicate and repetitive part of the entire process. He selected his softest brush, one made from squirrel hair, starting from the center of the page and working outwards in a slow, circular motion. He began to gently lift the accumulated surface dust of 190 years. The brush whispered across the paper, a sound barely audible even in the profound silence of the room. He worked in small, overlapping sections, his movements economical and infinitely patient. He was not scrubbing, he was coaxing the dust from its resting place, shepherding it towards the edge of the page where it could be brushed away onto the blotter. The process took nearly 40 minutes, and by the end, the paper had regained a fraction of its original brightness, the faded ink appearing just a little sharper against the clean background. Now, he turned his attention to the tear itself. The edges of the tear were slightly frayed, with tiny paper fibers misaligned. Before he could mend it, he had to ensure these fibers were lying as flat as possible. He took one of his finest microspatulas and, working under the magnifying lamp, he began to gently nudge and tease the fibers back into alignment. It was microscopic work. He would use the tip of the spatula to lift a single, hair-like fiber, and guide it back to its rightful place, encouraging the two sides of the tear to meet as seamlessly as they could. It was like solving a tiny, intricate puzzle. He did not rush. He worked along the entire length of the 90 mm tear, and then the 35 mm tear, his focus absolute. The tear was now prepared for mending. The repair would be made using Japanese tissue, a remarkable material renowned for its strength and near transparency. It was made from long kozo fibers, which meant that even a very thin sheet provided excellent support without obscuring the text under. Neath, Elias held a sheet of the tissue. Up to the light, it was almost like a sheet of captured mist. He laid the tissue over the tear to gauge the size of the patch he would need. He would not cut the tissue with scissors or a knife, as a sharp edge would be too visible and could create a stress point. Instead, he would water cut it. He took a fine-tipped brush, dipped it in a small bowl of deionized water, and carefully painted a thin, wet line on the tissue, tracing a shape slightly larger than the tear itself. He waited a moment for the water to soften the fibers. Then he gently pulled the tissue apart. It separated along the wet line, leaving a soft, feathered edge that would blend almost invisibly into the original paper once applied. The patch was ready. Now for the adhesive. In modern life, glue is a simple, instant thing. In conservation, it is a carefully prepared, reversible substance, Elias used a traditional wheat starch paste, which he made himself every few days. It was smooth, acid-free, and, most importantly, it could be undone in the future with a little moisture, meaning his repair would not be a permanent, irreversible alteration to the document. He took a tiny amount of the paste on the tip of a small, flat brush. He placed a sheet of mylar, a clear plastic film, underneath the tear to protect the blotter paper. Then, with a surgeon's steadiness, he began to apply a minuscule, almost transparent layer of the paste to the edges of the tear itself, working on the reverse side of the folio. He was careful not to use too much. An excess of moisture could cause the old paper to swell or the ink on the other side to bleed. With the paste applied, he carefully lifted his pre-cut patch of Japanese tissue with a pair of bamboo tweezers. He lowered it into position over the tear. It settled onto the page like a snowflake. He then placed a small piece of non-stick silicone paper over the patch. He took his polished bone folder and, with a gentle, even pressure, burnished the area. The smooth, cool surface of the bone pressed the tissue firmly onto the original paper, ensuring a perfect bond and smoothing out any potential air bubbles. The feather-edged patch seemed to melt into the folio, becoming a ghostly reinforcement. Rather than a clumsy patch, the repair was now made, but it needed to dry flat, under controlled pressure. Elias removed the protective mylar sheet from underneath. He then placed a fresh sheet of clean blotter paper over the folio, followed by a square of thick, felted wool to distribute the pressure evenly. Finally, he placed the small, heavy glass weight on top. He made a note in his logbook. L-shaped tear mended using 6 gsm sekishu Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste. Placed under weight to dry. Time, 16:45. The most critical part of the day's work was done. The folio would need to sit under the weight for several hours, and then be left to air dry overnight in a special press. Elias looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 5 p.m., the end of his working day. He did not begin another task. Instead, he began the slow, methodical process of cleaning his workspace. The brushes were cleaned with a soft cloth. The micro spatulas were wiped down and returned to their stand. The lid was placed securely back on the wheat starch paste, which was stored in a cool, dark cupboard. The blotter paper on his workbench was replaced with a fresh sheet, ready for the morning. His tools were once again in a perfect, straight line. He switched off the magnifying lamp. The bright, analytical light vanished, replaced by the soft, ambient glow of the main archive lighting. He stood up, the legs of his straight-backed chair making no sound on the floor. He took off his white cotton gloves and placed them in a container for laundering. He walked through the silent stacks of the archive, his footsteps soft and measured. He passed shelves holding centuries of human history, not in the grand deeds of kings, but in the small, accumulated details of ordinary lives, property deeds, tax records, birth registers, and the last will and testament of a forgotten farmer. He was a guardian of these small, quiet stories. He let himself out of the archive, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a soft sigh of compressed air, sealing the past in its climate-controlled stillness. He walked down the empty corridor, his footsteps now echoing slightly as he stepped out of the building and into the cool, damp air of the evening. The noise of the city returned. It felt distant, disconnected from the quiet, focused world he had just left. He did not think about deadlines or appointments. His mind was calm, occupied with the simple, tactile sensations of his work, the whisper of the squirrel hair brush, the translucence of the Japanese tissue, the smooth, cool glide of the bone folder over paper. His work was a form of meditation, It was a slow, deliberate act of care. He was not creating something new, but patiently and respectfully preserving something old. He was mending a tear not just in a piece of paper, but in the very fabric of continuity. He walked home through the grey evening, his pace unhurried. He knew that tomorrow he would return to the archive, he would check on the mended tear, then he would begin the next, equally patient process of reinforcing the ragged binding edge, and the day after that, perhaps, he would consider how to best stabilize the water-damaged corner. The work was endless, and it was a comfort. It was a quiet, noble fight against the slow, inevitable decay of all things, and in its silence, its patience, and its profound lack of drama, Elias Vance found a deep and abiding peace. The following morning, Elias arrived at the archive at his usual time. The sun was just beginning to cast long, pale shadows across the city streets. But within the windowless sanctuary of the conservation studio, the light was always the same, a steady, even, and shadowless luminescence provided by specialized overhead lamps. The air was cool and still, carrying its familiar, clean scent of old paper and archival board. The gentle hum of the climate control system was the only sound, a constant, soothing drone that was the building's heartbeat. He began his day as he always did, by checking the environmental monitors. He made a note of the temperature and relative humidity and his daily logbook. Both were within the narrow, acceptable parameters. The past was sleeping soundly. He walked over to his workbench, and the center, under the felt square and the heavy glass weight, lay folio 74. It had been under pressure all night, allowing the wheat starch paste to dry slowly and form a secure, flat bound. It was time to see the results of his work. He carefully lifted the glass weight and set it aside on a padded coaster. He removed the square of felt and the top sheet of blotter paper. There, lying on the clean blotter beneath, was the folio. He leaned in for a closer look. The repair was a success. The Japanese tissue had adhered perfectly, its feathered edges blending almost seamlessly into the texture of the original rag paper. The tear, which had been a jarring one the day before, was now a fine, almost invisible line, a healed scar. The folio was whole once more. He made a note in the project logbook. 11:05, mended tear checked. Bond is secure and flat. No cockling or discoloration. Proceeding with binding edge consolidation. The next task was to address the ragged left-hand edge of the page, where it had been torn from its original binding centuries ago. The edge was a chaotic fringe of weakened, fraying fibers. If left untreated, these small tears could easily grow, further compromising the integrity of the document. His goal was not to make the edge look new, but to stabilize it, to prevent any further damage. The process for this was different from mending a simple tear. It required the application of a reinforcing strip of Japanese tissue along the entire length of the damaged edge. He began by preparing his materials. He selected a sheet of Japanese tissue that was slightly heavier than the one he had used for the tear repair, 12 GSM instead of 6 GSM as th. His edge needed more structural support. He would need a strip that was approximately 15 millimeters wide and 420 millimeters long. Again, he did not use scissors. He took his fine-tipped brush, dipped it in deionized water, and painted to long, perfectly parallel lines onto the tissue. He then gently tore along these wet lines, producing a long, elegant strip with soft, feathery edges on both sides. Next, he prepared the folio itself. He placed a fresh sheet of mylar under the ragged binding edge to protect the work surface. He then took one of his finest bamboo-handled brushes and the jar of wheat starch paste. With a steady hand, he began to apply a thin, even layer of the paste along the frayed edge, working on the reverse side of the document. He was careful to apply the paste all the way to the very tips of the broken fibers, ensuring they would all be caught and secured by the reinforcing strip. With the paste applied, he carefully picked up the long strip of tissue with 2 pairs of bamboo tweezers, 1 pair in each hand to support its length. This was a delicate operation. The wet strengthened tissue was still fragile. He lowered the strip into position, aligning it so that it covered the damaged edge, with about half of its width on the original paper and half extending beyond it. He let it settle onto the pasted area. He placed a long, thin strip of non-stick silicone paper over the repair. Then, using his polished bone folder, he gently burnished the entire length of the strip, his movements smooth and consistent. He worked from the center outwards to each end, ensuring there were no trapped air bubbles and that the bond was uniform along the entire edge. The semi-transparent tissue acted as a stabilizing splint, gathering in the frayed, chaotic fibers and uniting them into a single, stronger edge. Their application was complete. Now, like the tear repair before it, it needed to dry under pressure. He carefully placed a fresh sheet of blotter paper over the folio, followed by the felt pad. This time, instead of the small glass weight, he used a long, rectangular steel weight, its shape better suited to applying even pressure along the entire length of the new mend. He made a new entry in his log book, 1105, binding edge stabilized, with 12 gsm sekishu tissue and wheat starch paste, placed under weight to dry, time 11:15. While the binding edge was drying, Elias turned his attention to a different, much simpler task. He had a collection of 19th century property deeds that needed to be rehoused in new, acid-free folders. It was methodical, repetitive work that required precision but little of the intense concentration needed for paper repair. He took the first deed from its old, acidic manila folder, which was brittle and yellowed with age. He carefully unfolded the large vellum document. It was covered in dense, intricate legal script. He gave it a gentle surface clean with a soft brush, removing any loose dust. Then he took a new folder, made of light gray, lignin-free archival board. Using his bone folder, he sharpened the crease of the new folder. He carefully placed the deed inside. He then took a small, acid-free paper tag and, with his neat, block capital handwriting, wrote the document's reference number on it. He tied the tag to the new folder with a piece of unbleached cotton tape. He repeated this process again and again. Take the old folder, remove the document, clean it gently, place it in a new, archival quality folder, write the label, tie the tag. Each step was deliberate and unhurried. The pile of deeds in old, decaying folders shrank, while the pile of deeds in new, stable, and protective folders grew. It was a quiet, satisfying transfer of stability, a small act of pushing back against the inevitable tide of decay. He worked this way for several hours. The only sounds were the soft whisper of his brush across vellum, the crisp rustle of the new folders, and the gentle thud as he stacked each rehoused document on the pile. The world outside the archive, with its dramas and its deadlines, was a distant, irrelevant concept. Here, in this quiet room, the only deadline was the slow, inexorable march of chemical degradation, and his work was a patient, daily rebellion against it. At the end of the day, just before it was time to clean his workstation, he returned to folio 74. He carefully removed the long steel weight, the felt, and the top blotter. He inspected the binding edge repair. It was perfect. The strip of tissue was now an integral part of the folio, a neat, strong, and translucent reinforcement. The frayed edge was gone, replaced by a stable, unified border. The folio was now whole and secure. The tear was mended. The edge was stabilized. It was ready to be returned to its place in the newly rebound ledger, ready for another century of quiet existence, ready for the casual glance of a future genealogist or historian. Elias felt a quiet, profound sense of accomplishment. It was not a feeling of excitement or pride, but one of deep, calm satisfaction. He had fulfilled his duty to this small, fragile piece of the past. He had listened to its needs and, with care and respect, he had healed its wounds. He began his evening clean-up ritual. The brushes were cleaned, the tools were wiped down, the workbench was cleared. He left the folio lying flat on its clean blotter, allowing it to acclimate to the room's environment overnight before its final placement. He switched off the desk lamp, and the soft darkness fell over his bench. He stood, his day's work complete. He walked through the silent stacks, past the rows and rows of quiet stories, and let himself out into the evening dot as he walked home. The setting sun casting a warm, golden light on the city's old stone buildings. His mind was peaceful. He thought of the looping, elegant handwriting on the folio. He thought of the names of the children who had been baptized in that small coastal village so long ago. He was a bridge, he thought, a quiet and seen connection between their time and his own. His work was a silent promise to them that they would not be entirely forgotten, and in that thought, Elias Vance found a deep and abiding sense of purpose. The next morning was cool and overcast, but inside the conservation studio, the light was as constant and unwavering as the gentle hum of the air filtration system. Elias Vance stood before his workbench, his hands clad in fresh white cotton gloves, and surveyed the work of the previous day. Folio 74 lay flat and serene on the clean blotter paper. The mended tear was a faint, almost imperceptible line. The stabilized binding edge was a neat, strong, and translucent border. The document was structurally sound. He made a brief, satisfied note in his project logbook. 1205, binding edge repair checked. Secure and flat. Folio is now stable. The structural repairs were complete, but the final stages of the conservation process still lay ahead. Today, his focus would be on the aesthetics and the long-term chemical stability of the paper. Specifically, he would address the foxing, the small, rust-colored spots that peppered the lower third of the page like tiny, faded constellations. These spots were the result of mold or iron contaminants and the paper reacting with the acidic environment over nearly 2 centuries. While they were currently stable, reducing them would not only improve the legibility and appearance of the document, but also help to neutralize any residual acidity. This was a task of extreme delicacy. It involved the localized application of a chemical solution, a process that required absolute control and a deep understanding of the paper's chemistry. He began by preparing his solution. He went to a locked cabinet where the conservation-grade chemicals were stored. He took out a bottle of deionized water, a bottle of ethanol, and a small container of calcium hydroxide powder. With the precision of a chemist, he measured out a small amount of the powder and mixed it into the water, creating a buffered aqueous solution with a specific, carefully controlled pH level. He then added a tiny percentage of ethanol, which would act as a surfactant, helping the solution to penetrate the paper fibers more evenly without excessive soaking. He placed this clear, odorless liquid in a small, covered ceramic dish. Returning to his bench, He positioned his magnifying lamp directly over the foxed area of the folio. Under the bright, circular light, each brown spot was a distinct, microscopic landscape. He would not be immersing the entire page. Instead, he would treat each spot, or each cluster of spots, individually. He selected his finest brush, one with a tip that consisted of only a few dozen sable hairs. He dipped the very tip of the brush into his prepared solution, then blotted it once on a clean piece of archival blotter paper to remove any excess. The brush was now damp, not wet. He chose his first target, a single, dark spot about the size of a pinhead. He brought the tip of the damp brush into contact with the very center of the spot. He held it there for a moment, allowing the capillary action of the paper to draw the minute amount of solution into the affected fibers. He then immediately took a small, pointed piece of clean blotter paper and touched it to the spot, wicking away the solution along with some of the discoloration. He looked at the tip of the blotter. It was stained a faint brownish yellow. He looked at the spot on the folio under the magnifier. It had not vanished, but it had lightened perceptibly. Its hard edges softened. The process was a success. Now, he simply had to repeat it. He moved to the next spot, a few millimeters away. He dipped the brush. He blotted it. He touched it to the paper. He waited a breath. He wickered the moisture away with a fresh piece of pointed blotter. He examined the result. It was a slow, painstaking, and deeply meditative cycle of actions. Dip, blot, touch, wick. He worked his way across the lower third of the page, moving from one small, brown island to the next. The work was so focused that the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the bright circle of light, the faded, brown ink of the 19th century script, and the gradual, subtle lightening of the age spots under his patient ministration. He was not erasing the history of the document or the evidence of its age. He was merely calming it, reducing the visual noise of decay so that the quiet voices of the names written there could be more clearly seen. The process took over 3 hours. By the time he had treated the last of the significant spots, the lower third of the page looked noticeably clearer. The contrast between the paper and the ink gently enhanced. The folio was now chemically cleaner and more stable. The treated area was now slightly damp and needed to be dried under pressure once more to prevent any cockling or warping of the paper. He placed the folio between 2 sheets of holotex, a very fine, non-stick polyester fabric that would protect the surface of the paper. He then placed this between 2 fresh sheets of thick blotter paper and slid the entire package into the center of a large, cast-iron book press. He turned the large screw handle of the press, applying a firm, even pressure across the entire surface of the folio. There it would remain for the rest of the day. With folio 70 for safely pressing, Elias turned to the final task in its conservation, preparing its permanent housing. Since it was no longer part of a bound volume, it could not be left loose. It required a custom-made enclosure that would protect it from dust, pollutants, and physical handling. He would create an L-sleeve from archival-grade polyester film, a clear, chemically inert material often known by the brand name Mylar. He took a large roll of the Mylar film and a fresh cutting mat. He measured the dimensions of the folio. He, then, using a long, heavy steel ruler and a sharp scalpel, cut 2 sheets of Mylar that were precisely 10 millimeters larger than the folio on all sides. The scalpel made a clean, crisp whispering sound as it sliced through the clear film. He now had 2 identical, perfectly clear rectangles of Mylar. To create the sleeve, he needed to weld 2 of the edges together. He took out his conservation tacking iron, a tool that looked like a miniature clothing iron with a very fine, temperature-controlled tip. he set the temperature to the precise level required to melt mylar. He placed the two sheets of mylar on top of each other, aligning them perfectly. He laid his steel ruler along one of the long edges, about 5 millimeters in from the side. Then, with a slow, steady hand, he ran the hot tip of the tacking iron along the ruler's edge. The tool hissed softly as it moved, the heat instantly fusing the two layers of mylar together into a single, strong, transparent seam. He repeated the process for one of the short edges, creating a stable L-shaped sleeve, open on two sides. This would allow the folio to be easily inserted and removed without sliding against the surface. The sleeve was complete. It was a simple object, almost invisible, but it was a perfect little fortress, a crystal-clear shield that would protect the fragile paper for generations to come. He looked at the clock. It was the end of the day. Folio 74 was resting in the press. Its custom-made home was waiting for it on the workbench. The final step, the uniting of the two, would be a job for tomorrow. He began his clean-up ritual. The ceramic dish was washed and dried. The brush was cleaned and reshaped. The tacking iron was cooled and put away. He cleared his workbench, leaving only the press and the new mylar sleeve. He switched off the lights and left the silent studio. As he walked home through the soft evening light, his mind was filled with a quiet sense of completion. He thought of the journey of the single piece of paper, its life in the parish ledger, its slow decline, and its arrival on his bench. He had mended its wounds, cleaned its surface, and built it a new, safe home. Tomorrow, he would place it inside, write a final entry in his logbook, and the project would be complete. And then, he would open a new box from the archives and meet the next quiet, fragile piece of the past that was in need of his care. The work, he thought, was never truly done, and that was a comfort. The following morning, Elias entered the conservation studio to the same profound and comforting silence. The gentle hum of the climate control system was a constant and changing presence, a sound that had become synonymous with the stillness of time itself. The light from the overhead lamps was clear and even, casting no shadows. It was a perfect and changing environment for the delicate work of preservation. His first action, as always, was to check the environmental log. Temperature, stable. Humidity, stable. He made a small, neat entry in the logbook. All was well. He walked over to his workbench. In the center stood the large, black cast-iron book press, its screw handle tightened down. Inside, resting between layers of blotter and holotext, was folio 74. It had spent the night under firm, even pressure, allowing the moisture from the spot treatment to dissipate completely, leaving the paper fibers to settle into a flat, stable state. With a slow, deliberate motion, he began to turn the large handle of the press. The screw turned with a well-oiled, deep groaning sound, a noise that seemed to come from another century. The pressure was released. He slid the package out from between the heavy plates of the press and placed it on his clean workbench. He lifted the top sheet of blotter paper, then the fine, almost transparent sheet of holotext. There lay the folio. He leaned in, his gloved hands resting on the edge of the bench. The paper was perfectly flat. The areas where he had performed the spot treatment were indistinguishable from the surrounding paper in texture. The faint, rust-colored foxing spots were now just ghostly suggestions of their former selves, softened and subdued. The overall impression was one of clean, quiet dignity. The document was no longer an invalid in critical care. It was a venerable survivor, its scars healed, its history respected. He picked up his project logbook and his fountain pen. On a new line, he wrote the final entry for the physical conservation work, 1305. Folio removed from press. Paper is flat, stable. Spot treatment successful. Discoloration significantly reduced. Physical conservation of folio 74 is now complete. He sat for a moment, simply looking at the piece of paper. He saw not just the object, but the entire process of the past few days, the gentle whisking of the squirrel hair brush, the delicate teasing of the torn fibers, the almost invisible application of the Japanese tissue, the patient, spot-by-spot lightening of the age stains. It was a quiet journey, and it had reached its destination. Now, for the very last step, the final housing. On the bench next to the folio lay the custom-made mylar sleeve he had fabricated the day before. It was clear, crisp, and waiting. This was the final act of protection, enclosing the fragile, conserved paper in a stable, inert environment that would shield it from dust, pollutants, and the friction of handling for the foreseeable future. He slid a long, thin, flexible mylar spatula tool designed for this very purpose into the sleeve to gently separate the two layers. This prevented any static electricity from causing the fragile paper to jump or cling as it was. Inserted, with the sleeve held open by the spatula, he carefully slid the folio, the old rag paper, with its new, reinforced binding edge, moved smoothly into the clear enclosure. He aligned it perfectly, so there was an even 10 millimeters border of clear mylar around the entire document. Then, he carefully slid the spatula out. The top layer of mylar settled down, leaving the folio resting safely within its transparent fortress. The work was done. He held up the sleeved folio. The mylar was so clear it was almost invisible. The names on the page, the record of the children baptized in St. Giles by the Sea in 1832, were now protected, yet perfectly visible. The document was ready for the future. He took the sleeved folio and walked over to a large, flat file map cabinet in the corner of the studio. He pulled open a wide, shallow drawer labeled Parish Records awaiting reshelving. Inside, the newly rebound ledger from St. Giles by the Sea was waiting. The rest of its pages had already been conserved. Folio 74 was the last piece. He would not insert it himself. That was a task for the archivists who managed the collections. His role was complete. He gently laid the sleeved folio on top of the bound volume, along with its completed conservation logbook. He slid the drawer shut. It closed with a soft, deep thump, a sound of finality. He returned to his workbench. It was now empty, save for his neatly arranged tools. The space in the center, which had been occupied for days by the fragile folio, was now a clean, blank slate. The project was over. There was no ceremony, no moment of celebration. There was only the quiet, internal satisfaction of a task brought to its proper conclusion. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was not yet midday. He had the rest of the day ahead of him. He walked over to a trolley that held incoming projects. From the archives, on the top shelf was a large, gray archival box. The label on the front read, Correspondence of Eleanor Vance, 1915 to 1918. A collection of letters from the First World War. His own great-aunt. He had put off working on his family's papers for years, always prioritizing the public collection. But the archivist had insisted it was his turn. He lifted the box and carried it back to his workbench. He placed it in the center of the clean, white blotter. He stood for a moment, looking at the plain gray box. Inside was a different kind of history, a personal one. The paper would be different, the ink different, the challenges different. But the process, he knew, would be the same. It would be a process of patience, of respect, of quiet, methodical care. He opened the box. Inside, tied in bundles with faded ribbon, were dozens of letters, the paper thin and fragile, the handwriting a delicate, spidery script. He lifted out the first bundle. He could smell the faint, century-old scent of paper and dried ink. He sat down in his chair. He took out a fresh log book. He picked up his fountain pen, and with a calm, focused mind, he began the new project, writing the first entry on a clean, blank page. The quiet work continued. The silence of the room was the same. The gentle hum of the ventilation was the same. The light was the same. Another journey was just beginning, and in this endless, gentle cycle of care and preservation, Elias Vance found his purpose and his peace. The grey archival box sat in the center of Elias's workbench, a silent repository of a time long past. For years, he had treated the history contained within the archive's walls with a professional, respectful distance. He was a conservator, a caretaker of other people's stories. But this box was different. The label, Correspondence of Eleanor Vance 1915 to 1918, marked it as part of his own history. A collection of letters from his great-aunt, a woman he had never known but whose name was a quiet echo in his family's memory. He lifted the lid. The air that rose from the box was dry and carried the faint, slightly sweet scent of old paper and the ghost of a pressed flower. Inside, neatly arranged, were several bundles of letters, each tied with a faded, brittle silk ribbon that had once been a vibrant color, perhaps pink or blue, but had now mellowed to a uniform shade of dusty ivory. The envelopes were thin, almost translucent in places, and the stamps bore the portrait of King George V. For a long moment, Elias did not move. He simply looked, allowing the reality of the objects to settle in. These were not just documents, to be assessed for foxing or paper acidity. They were conversations, frozen in time. They were the tangible remnants of a young woman's hopes and fears during a time of immense global turmoil. His training, however, was a deeply ingrained discipline. It provided a framework, a calm and orderly procedure to follow, even in the face of this unexpected, subtle emotional resonance. He would treat these letters with the same methodical care he gave to any other document. The process itself would be his anchor. He began, as always, with a preliminary assessment. He chose one of the thicker bundles and, with the utmost care, began to untie the fragile silk ribbon. It was so brittle that it threatened to crumble at his touch. Using a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, he gently teased the knot loose. The ribbon, its duty done after more than a century, came apart in his hands. He carefully placed the fragments in a small, labeled Glassini envelope, a small act of preserving even the ephemera. The bundle was now free. It consisted of about 20 letters, all addressed to his great-aunt Eleanor at an address in rural Suffolk. The postmarks were from the British Expeditionary Force in France. He took the first letter on the top of the stack. The envelope was creased and soft, worn from its long journey and a century of storage. He used a very thin, flexible micro-spatula to carefully open the flap, which was barely sealed anymore. Inside was a single sheet of thin, folded paper. He gently unfolded it. The paper was fragile, almost onion skin thin, and covered in a dense, neat, and surprisingly small handwriting in faded black ink. It was dated August 1916. He did not read the words. Not yet. His focus was on the physical object. He placed the single sheet on a fresh piece of blotter paper under his magnifying lamp. He examined the paper. It was acidic, hardwood pulp paper, typical of the wartime period when high-quality rag paper was scarce. It was already yellowed and brittle. far more so than the 1830 to rag paper of folio 74. He noted the small, dark flecks within the paper's structure, impurities from the manufacturing process. He saw the way the iron gall ink had started to corrode the paper from within, a slow, chemical fire that was eating away at the very fibers it inscribed. In a few places, the ink had burned straight through, leaving tiny, lace-like holes in the page. He made his first entry in the new project logbook, his handwriting as neat and dispassionate as ever. Item 001, letter, single sheet, folded, dimensions, 180 millimeters by 220 millimeters, paper, acidic wood pulp, brittle, condition, significant ink corrosion, multiple small losses, general discoloration. Vertical and horizontal fold lines are weak. He then examined the envelope, making similar notes about its condition. The stamp was a King George V 1D red. The postmark was faint, but under the magnifier he could just make out the words Army Post Office. He proceeded this way for the next few letters in the bundle. Each one was a small, self-contained world of preservation challenges. Some had small tears along the fold lines. One had a faint, brownish stain in the corner, a ghost of a long evaporated drop of tea or water. Each letter, and its corresponding envelope, was given a unique item number, and its condition was meticulously recorded in the log. The process was slow and repetitive. Open envelope, unfold letter, examine paper, examine ink, note condition, assign number. It was a familiar rhythm, a comforting litany of observation and documentation. It allowed him to engage with the letters as physical artifacts, keeping the emotional content at a safe distance. After documenting the first bundle, he knew what the primary challenges of the project would be: deacidification and reinforcement. The acidic paper was inherently self-destructive. If left untreated, it would eventually crumble into dust. The ink corrosion was a form of irreversible damage, but the paper around the affected areas could be stabilized to prevent further losses. He decided to begin a test on a single, representative letter. He chose one that was in moderately poor condition, with significant yellowing but only minor ink corrosion. The first step would be to test the ink for solubility. Before he could perform any treatment involving moisture such as deacidification, he had to be absolutely certain that the ink would not run or feather. He took the chosen letter and placed it under his microscope. He focused on a single dark, thickly inked word. He then took a tiny, pointed sable brush, one with only a few hairs. At its tip, he dipped it in a drop of deionized water, then touched it to a piece of blotter to wick away almost all the moisture. The brush was now infinitesimally damp. With a surgeon's precision, he touched the very tip of the damp brush to an inconspicuous part of the ink line. While watching intently through the microscope, he held his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible halo of brownish gray began to bloom from the edge of the ink line into the surrounding paper fibers. The ink was soluble. It was fugitive. He sat back. This changed everything. Standard aqueous deacidification, the most effective method, was now impossible. It would turn the entire letter into an unreadable, watery blur. He made a crucial note in his logbook, underlining the words, ink tested, soluble in water. This was not a failure. It was information. His work was a series of such small, quiet discoveries. He would have to use a non-aqueous deacidification method, a more complex and time-consuming process involving organic solvents and a magnesium oxide spray, performed in a special fume hood. That would be a task for another day, a new set of challenges to be methodically addressed. He looked at the clock. It was the end of his day. He had not read a single word of his great-aunt's correspondence. But he now understood the physical language of the letters. He understood their fragility, their inherent vice, the chemical secrets they held. He carefully placed the letters he had assessed back into the archival box. Separated by sheets of acid-free tissue paper, he closed the lid and left the box in the center of his workbench. He began his clean-up ritual. The microscope was covered. The brushes were cleaned. The small water dish was dried and put away. The workspace was wiped down, ready for the morning. He switched off the lamp and left the studio, the heavy door sighing shut behind him. He walked home through the city as the streetlights began to glow, their pale, artificial light a stark contrast to the soft, natural light of his studio. His mind was not on the traffic or the noise of the evening rush. It was occupied with the problem of the fugitive ink. He thought about the chemistry of non-aqueous deacidification, the particle size of the magnesium oxide, the required ventilation. The problem was an intellectual puzzle, and he felt a quiet sense of purpose in preparing to solve it. He knew that tomorrow he would begin the next stage, and eventually, once the letters were physically stable, once their slow decay had been arrested, then, and only then, would he allow himself to read the words. He would earn that right, he felt, by first saving the paper on which they were written. The stories could wait. The quiet, methodical work of preservation always came first. The following morning, Elias entered the conservation studio and was greeted by the familiar, reassuring hum of the climate control system. The world outside was busy with its own concerns. But within these walls, the primary concern was the slow, molecular decay of paper, and the patient, human effort to wrest it. His first task was to address the problem he had identified the previous day, the fugitive ink on his great-aunt Eleanor's letters. Aqueous treatment was not an option. He would have to employ a non-aqueous deacidification process, a specialized technique reserved for such delicate situations. This was not work that could be done at his open bench. The process involved chemical solvents that required a controlled environment. He walked over to a large, glass-fronted fume hood that stood against the far wall of the studio. It was a self-contained workstation with its own powerful ventilation system, designed to safely handle volatile chemicals. He began by preparing the workspace inside the hood. He laid down a fresh sheet of clean blotter paper. He then brought over the archival box of letters and selected the same test letter from the day before. He also gathered his materials, a shallow glass tray, a canister of archival-grade deacidification spray, and a set of wide, soft brushes. The spray contained a solution of microscopic particles of magnesium oxide suspended in an inert solvent. When sprayed onto paper, the solvent would quickly evaporate, leaving behind the alkaline magnesium oxide particles, which would neutralize the acid in the paper and act as a buffer against future acid attacks. He switched on the fume hood's internal light and fan. A low, rushing sound filled the quiet studio as the fan pulled a steady current of air into the hood and through a series of filters. He placed the single, fragile sheet of the letter into the shallow glass tray. He took the canister of deacidification spray, shook it vigorously to ensure the particles were evenly suspended, and, from a distance of about 6 inches, he began to apply a fine, even mist to the surface of the paper. He moved the can back and forth in a steady, sweeping motion, just as if he were spray painting a delicate canvas. A faint, chemical scent filled the air inside the hood, but was immediately whisked away by the ventilation fan. He watched as the solvent momentarily darkened the paper, making the yellowed sheet look wet, before it began to evaporate almost instantly, leaving the paper looking unchanged, but now carrying its invisible, protective cargo of alkaline particles. He sprayed one side, waited a minute for the solvent to fully evaporate, and then, using two pairs of tweezers, he carefully turned the delicate sheet over. He then sprayed the reverse side with the same even, sweeping motion. The deacidification was complete. The letter was now chemically stabilized. Its internal, self-destructive process rested. The process had taken only a few minutes, but it was the result of years of chemical research and conservation science. He carefully removed the letter from the fume hood and placed it between two sheets of holotex. He then placed it in the book press to ensure it remained perfectly flat as the last traces of the solvent dissipated. With the chemical treatment tested and proven successful, he could now turn his attention to the physical repairs. The primary issue with these letters was the weakness of the fold lines. Decades of being folded and unfolded, combined with the inherent brittleness of the acidic paper, had left the creases on the verge of tearing completely. They needed reinforcement. He returned to his main workbench. The process would be similar to the binding edge repair he had performed on folio 74, but on a much finer and more delicate scale. He took out his thinnest grade of Japanese tissue, a gossamer light for GSM paper that was almost as transparent as air. He would need several very thin strips to lay along the weakened folds. He began the patient process of water-cutting the tissue, painting thin lines of water with his finest brush and then tearing the tissue to create strips just 3 millimeters wide, each with a soft, feathery edge. The work was so precise it felt like handling strands of smoke. He then took a different letter from the bundle, one with a particularly fragile central fold. He placed it face down on his bench. With a sheet of mylar underneath the fold line, he prepared his wheat starch paste. Using his smallest brush, he applied a tiny, almost invisible line of the paste along the weakened crease dot. Then came the most delicate part of the operation. He picked up one of the 3 millimeters tissue strips with his finest tweezers. The strip was so light that the static electricity in the room threatened to make it jump and cling to his tools. He held his breath, his hand perfectly steady, and lowered the strip into position directly over the pasted fold line. It settled onto the paper. He placed a small piece of silicone paper over it and, using the polished tip of his bone folder, he gently burnished it, bonding the tissue to the paper. The result was a near-invisible reinforcement. The gossamer tissue was just strong enough to support the weakened crease, preventing it from tearing, yet it was so transparent that it did not obscure the handwriting on the other side. He looked at the clock. It was well into the afternoon. He had successfully deacidified one letter and reinforced a fold on another. It was slow, painstaking progress. A single box of letters, he estimated, could easily take him several weeks to fully conserve. He did not feel rushed. He felt a deep sense of connection to the work as he handled the fragile paper. He felt as though he was in a quiet dialogue with the past. He was not a historian reading the content, but a physician diagnosing the physical ailments of the object itself. For the remainder of the afternoon, he continued the methodical work of reinforcing the folds on a few more of the letters. Each one presented its own minor challenge, a small tear branching off a fold line that needed a tiny, custom-shaped patch, an area of incursion so severe that he had to reinforce the paper round it before he could touch the nearby fold. At the end of the day, he had a small, neat stack of 5 letters that had been fully treated, deacidified and reinforced. They were now physically stable. They were safe. He placed them carefully in a new, acid-free archival folder, separate from the others. He made a detailed entry in his logbook, documenting the exact process he had used. He cleaned his workspace with his usual meticulous care. The fume hood was switched off, its rushing sound replaced by the familiar, gentle hum of the main system. The brushes were cleaned, the paste jar was sealed, the tools were aligned. He switched off his desk lamp and left the studio. As he walked home in the fading light, his mind was calm. He thought of the invisible shield of magnesium oxide he had applied to the paper. He thought of the near-invisible strength of the Japanese tissue strips. He had spent his day performing quiet, almost imperceptible acts of care. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think about the words he had, in the course of his work, inevitably seen snippets of the text, phrases like "My dearest Eleanor," and "The mud is simply dreadful," and "I hope the roses in the garden are doing well." He knew that soon, when the entire collection was stable, he would sit down and read them all, from beginning to end. He would finally meet the young man who wrote them and the great aunt who received them. He would, after all his physical work was done, finally allow himself to conserve their story. But not yet. The quiet, methodical work always came first. Days turned into a week, and the week flowed into the next, each marked by the same quiet, repetitive, and deeply focused work. The archival box containing the correspondence of Eleanor Vance became the singular landscape of Elias's world. The initial challenges, once identified, had set the rhythm for his labor. Each morning began at the fume hood, where he would carefully deacidify a small batch of the fragile, acidic letters. The fine, misty spray of magnesium oxide was the first act of preservation, an invisible shield laid down against the slow ravages of time. After the letters had been treated and allowed to rest, he would spend the long, silent hours of the afternoon at his main workbench, engaged in the microscopic physical repairs. His world shrank to the width of a fold line, the length of a 3 mm strip of Japanese tissue. The litany of his actions was as regular as a prayer. Paint the thin line of wheat starch paste, lift the gossamer-like tissue with tweezers, lower it into place. Burnish gently with the bone folder. He mended the tiny, branching tears that spiderwebbed from the main creases. He reinforced the corners of envelopes that had grown soft and frayed from a century of handling. He worked without haste, giving each letter, each envelope, his complete and undivided attention. He had conserved documents of great historical importance, charters signed by kings and maps that had defined nations. Yet, he found himself treating these simple, personal letters with an even deeper sense of reverence. He was not just a conservator, he was now a custodian of his own family's quiet history. Throughout this process, he maintained his professional discipline. He did not read the letters. He trained his eyes to see only the physical properties of the words, the way the ink sat on the paper, the areas of corrosion, the legibility, but not to assemble them into senses, not to absorb their meaning. It was a strange, bifurcated form of seeing, one that he had perfected over his long career. It allowed him to remain objective, to focus solely on the craft of preservation. The stories could wait. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of this patient, methodical work, the last letter was treated. The last fold was reinforced. The last page was pressed flat. The archival box was now empty of untreated documents. In its place on his workbench stood a neat stack of acid-free folders, each containing a small number of the conserved letters, now stable, secure, and safe. He made the final entry in his project logbook, 2805. Final letter item 112 conserved. All items deacidified and reinforced. Project conservation phase complete. He cleaned his workbench with his usual meticulous care. He put away the Japanese tissue, the paste, the brushes. His tools were wiped down and returned to their stand. The physical work was done. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was early afternoon. For the first time in weeks, a project was not waiting for his immediate attention. There was a quiet, open space in his day. He stood up and walked to the small kitchenette at the back of the archive. He prepared a cup of tea, a rare indulgence during his working hours. He carried the steaming mug back to his desk and sat down. He reached for the first folder in the neat stack. He opened it. He carefully took out the first letter he had worked on, the one dated August 1916. The paper, once brittle and yellowed, now felt stable in his hands, its color a little brighter, its texture more robust, and now, for the first time, he allowed himself to read. The handwriting was small and tight, the words packed closely together to conserve space on the thin paper. The letter began, "My dearest Eleanor." The writer was a young man named Thomas. From the context, Elias gathered he was a childhood friend, perhaps a sweetheart. He was writing from a trench near the Somme. Elias read slowly, his mind, so long focused on the physical, now shifting to absorb the meaning. The letter was a strange and poignant mix of the horrific and the mundane. Thomas wrote of the endless rain, the sucking mud that seemed to swallow everything, and the constant, dull roar of artillery in the distance, a sound he said had become as normal as birdsong. But then, he would abruptly shift topics. He asked Eleanor if she had managed to harvest the plums from the old tree by the stone wall. He wondered if her father's new dog had learned to fetch yet. He recalled a summer day years before when they had gone for a picnic by the river, and he described the pattern on the blanket she had used. Elias sat motionless in the profound silence of the archive, the only sound the quiet hum of the ventilation. He was no longer a conservator looking at an object. He was a reader, a listener, a silent witness to a conversation from 100 years ago. He was reading a young man's desperate attempt to hold onto the memory of a peaceful, ordinary world while trapped in the midst of an unimaginable nightmare. He finished the first letter and carefully placed it back in its folder. He picked up the next one, and the next. He spent the entire afternoon reading. He moved through the autumn of 1916, into the bitter winter, and then the spring of 1917. The tone of the letters began to change. The memories of home became more vivid, more desperate. The descriptions of the war became more sparse, more guarded, as if some things were simply too terrible to write down. But between the lines, Elias could feel the young man's exhaustion. His fading hope. He read about small moments of relief, a tin of biscuits that had arrived from home, a rare day of sunshine, a letter received from Eleanor. These small joys were recounted with an almost heartbreaking level of detail. He read names of Thomas's friends, young men who were mentioned cheerfully, and one letter, and then were simply, quietly, absent from the next. Finally, he came to the last bundle of letters. The postmarks were from late 1917. The handwriting was the same, but it seemed more hurried, less steady. The letters were shorter. The cheerful reminiscences were gone, replaced by simple, earnest declarations of his affection for Eleanor and his desperate longing for the war to be over. He opened the very last letter in the collection. It was dated October 1917. It was very short. It spoke of an upcoming big push. He told Eleanor not to worry, that he was well, and that he hoped to be home by Christmas. He ended the letter with the words, "Whatever happens, know that my last thoughts will be of you and of the sunshine on the river bank. Yours always, Thomas." Elias stared at the last line. He knew. from his family's sparse oral history, that his great-aunt Eleanor had never married. He knew that she had lost her sweetheart in the Great War. This was him. This was the young man whose ghost had quietly inhabited his family for a century. There were no more letters from Thomas. He carefully folded the last letter and placed it back in its folder. He stacked the folders neatly. The story was over. The quiet, personal archive now held a new and profound weight. He sat for a long time at his workbench, the untouched cup of tea growing cold beside him. The hum of the archive seemed louder now, a sound that measured not just the passing of time, but the immense, silent weight of all the stories it held. His work felt different now. He had always seen it as a technical, scientific process, but he now understood, in a way he never had before, that what he was truly conserving was not paper, not ink. He was conserving the fragile, irreplaceable vessel of a human heart. He stood up. He took the stack of folders containing the conserved letters and walked over to the cabinet where his personal effects were stored. He would not leave them in the general archive. He would take them home. Their journey as archival documents was over. Their life as a family memory could now begin. He packed the folders carefully into his briefcase. He tidied his empty workbench one last time, his movements as slow and deliberate as ever. He switched off the lamp, and the soft darkness fell. He left the studio, the heavy door sighing shut behind him, closing a chapter on his own quiet history. And as he walked home, he carried with him not just a collection of conserved letters, but the profound and silent story of a promise kept, a memory preserved, and a love that had, in its own small, quiet way, survived. Elias carried the briefcase containing his great-aunt's letters home through the cool evening air. The weight of it felt different from his usual burden of research papers or logbooks. It felt heavier, denser, imbued with the quiet gravity of the story it now held for him. He walked his usual route, past the familiar brick buildings and the small city park, but he saw them differently tonight, as if a new filter had been placed over his eyes. The world seemed more layered, more resonant with the unseen histories of all the people who had walked these same streets before him. When he arrived at his small, tidy house, the silence that greeted him was also different. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a vessel, waiting to be filled. He placed the briefcase on the small wooden table in his hallway, not opening it, but just letting it be a new presence in his home. For the next several days, Elias returned to his work at the archive, but his rhythm had subtly changed. He began a new project, the painstaking surface cleaning of a large, rolled 18th century estate map. He performed the work with his usual meticulous skill. The dry cleaning, sponges, the soft brushes, the careful, methodical movements all were the same. Yet, his internal state was different. As he worked, gently lifting the dust from the finely drawn property lines and the elegant car-touches, his mind often drifted back to the letters. He thought of Thomas's neat, compact handwriting and the way it had grown less steady over time. He pictured the small, rural world the young man had longed for, the plum tree, the river bank, the garden roses, the abstract concept of the past, which he had dealt with his entire professional life, had now been given a human face, a specific, tangible sorrow. The names on the documents he conserved were no longer just data points. They were echoes of lives as real and as fragile as his own. One evening, a week after bringing the letters home, he found himself standing before a dusty bookcase in his own living room. On the bottom shelf were several old, leather-bound family photo albums he had inherited years ago but had seldom opened. He pulled one out. Its cover was embossed with the single word, Vance. He sat down in his armchair, the same one his father had used, and opened the album. The thick, black pages were filled with stiff, sepia-toned photographs, formal portraits of stern-looking Victorian ancestors, faded group shots from forgotten family picnics. He turned the pages slowly, the old paper making a soft, dry, rustling sound. And then he found her, a photograph of a young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, with dark, intelligent eyes and a gentle, reserved smile. She wore a high-collared white dress. A caption, written in his grandmother's elegant, looping script, read, "Eleanor, summer 1914. Elias stared at the photograph. This was her, the recipient of the letters. The young woman who had waited. He looked at her face, trying to see the person who had read those words of love and longing from a muddy trench in France. He saw a quiet strength in her eyes, a hint of the resilience that had allowed her to live a long and, by all accounts, peaceful life, even after such a profound loss. He felt a sudden, quiet sense of connection, a bridge across the century that separated them. He was not just her great-nephew, the distant inheritor of her papers. He was the one who had, in his own small way, cared for her story, reinforcing the fragile pages just as she must have reinforced her own heart. Inspired, he began a new, personal project. It was not a conservation project, but one of curation. He went to a specialty shop and bought a beautiful, handmade archival box, this one bound in dark blue book cloth. He also bought sheets of the finest, acid-free archival paper. That weekend, he began the work. He took the conserved letters, now safe in their mylar sleeves, and began to transcribe them. He sat at his dining room table, a single lamp casting a warm pool of light, and copied each letter by hand onto the new paper. He used a simple fountain pen with permanent, carbon-based black ink. He was not a calligrapher, but his handwriting was neat, clear, and patient. The process of transcription was a form of deep reading. He had to pay attention to every word, every comma, every quirk of Thomas's phrasing. The story moved through him, flowing from his eyes to his mind, down his arm, and out through the nib of his pen. He was not just preserving a physical object anymore. He was preserving the words themselves, giving them a new, stable home. As he wrote, he felt the rhythm of the correspondence. He transcribed Thomas's letters, and then, in the spaces between them, he imagined Eleanor's replies, the letters that were now lost to time. He imagined her sitting at a small wooden desk, perhaps late at night, writing words of hope and encouragement, sending small pieces of home across the sea. After he had transcribed all of Thomas's letters, he took the photograph of Eleanor from the old album. He had a professional, archival quality copy made. He placed the copy of the photograph at the very end of the transcribed letters. Finally, he wrote a short colophon on the last page, a concluding note in his neat, conservator's hand. It read, "Correspondence of Thomas Lowell to Eleanor Vance, 1916–1917. Original letters conserved and transcribed by her great-nephew, Elias Vance. The originals remain. This copy is made in memory of them both." He gathered the transcribed pages, the photograph, and the original letters in their mylar sleeves. He placed them all together in the new, dark blue archival box. He tied the box shut with a simple and bleached cotton ribbon. His work was complete. He had taken a bundle of fragile, decaying papers and transformed them into a stable, accessible, and deeply personal archive. He had honored both the physical object and the human story it contained. He placed the blue box on the shelf in his study, not hidden away, but in a place of quiet prominence. It was a tangible piece of his own past, a story he now knew and would carry with him. The next Monday, he returned to the archive. He walked into the cool, silent studio and over to his workbench. A new project was waiting for him on the trolley. It was a large, bound volume of 19th century municipal water board records. The leather on the spine was cracked and peeling. The paper was suffering from mildew damage. It was a technical, impersonal, and deeply challenging conservation task. Elias looked at the damaged volume. He felt no sense of anticlimax. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He picked up the heavy book and placed it in the center of his workbench. He opened his logbook to a fresh page. He picked up his pen. He knew that within these dry, bureaucratic pages, filled with columns of figures and technical reports, were other stories, the story of a city's growth, the story of the engineers who had built the system, the story of the countless, nameless people who had benefited from the clean water it provided. Every document, he now understood more profoundly than ever, held a human story, no matter how deeply it was buried in the technical details. His job was to care for the vessel, to mend the paper, stabilize the ink, and reinforce the binding, so that the stories within, whether of a great love or a new sewer line, would have a chance to survive. He switched on his magnifying lamp. The bright, clear light fell upon the damaged page, and with a calm, steady hand, Elias Vance began the quiet, methodical work that was his life's purpose. The hum of the archive was a gentle, constant companion. The work continued, and he was at peace. Months passed, turning into a season, then another. The steady, quiet rhythm of Elias's life remained unchanged on the surface. Each morning, he would walk to the archive. Each day, he would sit at his workbench, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and perform the slow, meticulous work of preservation. He mended the waterboard records, reinforcing the brittle, mildew-damaged paper with painstaking care. He then moved on to a collection of early 20th century architectural blueprints, a challenging project that involved humidifying and flattening large, rolled documents that had been tightly stored for decades. His work was, as always, a model of professional excellence. His logbook entries were precise. His repairs were technically perfect, almost invisible. Yet, something within him had shifted. The experience with his great-aunt's letters had left an indelible mark. A new layer of meaning settled over his familiar routines like a fine, translucent sheet of Japanese tissue. He began to see the provenance of an object not just as a chain of ownership, but as a chain of contact. He would look at a thumbprint smudge on the margin of a 19th century deed and see not an imperfection to be cleaned, but a direct, physical link to the person who had last held it. He would examine the way the paper on a ledger was worn thin at the bottom right corner and understand it as the ghostly trace of 1,000-page turns by a clerk long dead. He was conserving not just paper and ink, but the faint, lingering echo of human touch. This new sensibility began to subtly inform his work. He became even more committed to the principle of minimal intervention. If a stain did not threaten the chemical stability of the paper, he would now be more inclined to leave it, seeing it as part of the document's unique life story. His work became less about returning an object to a pristine state and more about respectfully ushering it into the future, its history intact but its decay arrested. His quiet life outside the archive also began to expand in small, almost imperceptible ways. He had always been a man of solitary habits, content with his books and his quiet home. But now, He felt a new, gentle curiosity about the stories around him. He started visiting the local history section of the city library on his lunch breaks. He would sit at a large, sunlit table and read old newspapers on microfilm, not for any specific research purpose, but simply to immerse himself in the daily life of the past. He read about the opening of the municipal park he walked through every day. He read the advertisements for shops that had long since vanished. He read the birth and death notices, seeing the familiar local surnames and feeling a new sense of connection to the generations that had populated his city. One Saturday, he took a train out to the coast, to the area where the parish of St. Giles by the Sea had once been. He had conserved folio 74, the baptismal record from 1832 months ago, but he now felt a pull to see the place itself. The village was long gone, absorbed into a larger coastal town. But he found the old church. It was a small, squat building, of grey stone, its roof covered in moss, standing resilient against the salty wind from the sea. The churchyard was overgrown, the headstones leaning at odd angles, their inscriptions blurred by centuries of wind and rain. He walked through the tall grass, his footsteps quiet. He didn't search for any of the names from the folio. It was enough just to be there, to feel the cool, damp air, to hear the cry of the gulls and the distant crash of the waves. He was standing in the place where those children had been brought, where their lives had been officially recorded on the very piece of paper he had held and mended in his hands. The connection felt profound, a closed circle between the document and the place, with him as the quiet, respectful intermediary. This new habit of quiet exploration became a regular part of his weekends. He would take a map, often a historical one from the archives collection, and choose a place to visit. An old stone bridge mentioned in a 19th century land dispute document, the site of a former mill he had seen on an industrial survey. These small pilgrimages were not exciting. They were slow, solitary, and deeply peaceful. He was walking through the landscape of the documents he preserved, layering the tangible, present-day world over the ghostly traces of the past he worked. With every day dot back in the studio, this growing sense of context made him a resource for the younger archivists and researchers. They had always respected his technical skill, but now they began to seek him out for his deeper, more holistic understanding. A young doctoral student, struggling to understand a reference in a 19th century letter, would find that Elias could not only explain the type of paper it was written on, but could also describe the likely social context of the writer, the common phrases of the period, the very feel of the world from which the letter had come. He never presented himself as an expert, but his quiet, thoughtful insights became invaluable. One afternoon, a young intern brought him a small, leather-bound diary from the 1890s that was suffering from severe mold damage. As Elias began his preliminary assessment, the intern watched, fascinated by his meticulous process. "It must be wonderful," the young woman said softly, "to save these things." Elias paused, his tweezers hovering over a damaged page. He looked up, his gaze calm and direct. "We don't save them," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "They are already saved. They have survived. Our job is simply to make their continued survival a little easier. We are just quiet assistants to their resilience." The intern looked at him, then at the diary, and a new understanding seemed to dawn in her eyes. Elias returned his attention to the diary. He saw the faded, looping handwriting. He saw the ghostly blooms of mold. He saw another vessel, another story waiting. His work was not a grand battle against time, but a series of small, quiet collaborations with it. He was a partner to the past, helping it to whisper its stories into the future. He picked up his softest brush. The light in the studio was constant and clear. The hum of the archive was a steady, peaceful drone. The work was there, waiting for him. And in the quiet, unfolding continuity of his purpose, Elias Vance had found a profound and lasting contentment. His world was no longer confined to the four walls of his studio. It had expanded to encompass the silent, layered histories all around him, and his place within that vast, quiet story was secure. The years flowed by, as steady and quiet as the filtered air circulating through the archive. Elias Vance grew older, his movements perhaps a little slower. The lines on his face etched a little deeper. But his hands remained as steady and his focus as unwavering as ever. The archive was his constant, his sanctuary, and his life's work. The world outside changed in loud and dramatic ways. Technology accelerated. Cities grew taller. The pace of life quickened, but within the climate-controlled stillness of the conservation studio, the fundamental truths of his craft remained the same. Paper was still paper, ink was still ink, and time was still the patient, relentless force he worked in quiet partnership with. He became a venerable figure in the archive, a living part of its institutional memory. New interns and junior conservators would watch him work with a kind of awe, marveling at the zen-like economy of his movements. He never hurried, yet his work was always completed with a quiet efficiency. He taught them the technical skills, of course, how to mix the perfect wheat starch paste, how to water-cut Japanese tissue, the delicate art of non-aqueous deacidification. But more than that, he taught them the philosophy of his craft. Listen to the document, he would say, his voice soft. It will tell you what it needs. Don't impose your will on it. Your job is not to make it new, but to help it continue its journey as itself. He mentored a young conservator named Isobel, a woman who shared his quiet temperament and his deep, instinctual respect for the materials. He saw in her a successor, someone who understood that their work was not a science of dramatic interventions, but an art of gentle, respectful assistance. He passed on to her the small, unwritten wisdoms of his craft, the feel of paper that is ready to be humidified, the precise angle at which to hold a bone folder to achieve the perfect crease, the subtle change in scent that indicates a new mold. Outbreak. The blue archival box containing his great-aunt Eleanor's letters remained on the shelf in his study at home. It was not an object he revisited often. He did not need to. The story it contained had become a part of him, a quiet, foundational knowledge that informed his perspective on everything else. The box was a touchstone, a reminder of the moment his work had transcended from a technical craft to a deeply personal vocation. One year, the archive received a significant grant to digitize its most fragile collections. A team of technicians, armed with high-resolution scanners and complex imaging software, Elias watched them work with a quiet, detached curiosity. He saw the value in their efforts, of course. Digitization made the documents accessible to the world. It created a backup, a ghost of the original that could survive even if the physical object was lost. But as he watched the brilliant, cold light of the scanner pass over a 17th-century manuscript he had painstakingly repaired, he knew that something essential was being missed. The digital image could capture the words, the shape of the letters, the stains on the page, but it could not capture the weight of the paper in one's hand. It could not capture the subtle texture of the rag pulp, the way the iron gall ink had etched itself into the fibers, or the faint, dry scent of centuries. It could capture the information, but it could not capture the presence. His work, he realized, was the conservation of presence. As he neared retirement, he began a final, personal project within the archive. He started a small, informal catalogue, separate from the main archival system. He called it the haptic register. For each document he had worked on over the past few years, he would write a short, impressionistic description, not of its contents, but of its physical being. For a 19th century farmer's diary, he wrote, "The paper is soft and yielding, worn thin at the corners from years of being carried in a pocket. The binding, though repaired, still holds the gentle curve of its owner's hand." For an 18th century legal deed, he wrote, "The vellum is stiff and cool, with a sound like quiet thunder when it is unrolled. The ink on the seals is raised, a tiny, brittle sculpture." For the waterboard records, he noted, "The paper has a faint, earthy smell of dampness and mold, a scent that speaks of its long life in a forgotten basement storeroom. It feels slightly gritty to the touch." It was a catalogue of feelings, of textures, of scents and sounds. It was his quiet rebellion against the flattening of the world into data. It was his testimony to the soul of the object. He shared it only with Isobel, who understood its purpose immediately and began to add her own entries. The day of his retirement came without fanfare, just as he wished. There was a small gathering in the staff room, with a cake and a cup of tea. His colleagues gave him a beautifully crafted set of new conservation tools and a rare, first edition book on the history of paper making. He thanked them with his characteristic quiet grace. He shook their hands, and then he went back to his studio one last time. Isobel was there, standing by his workbench. The bench was perfectly clean, the tools arranged in their neat, familiar row. "It will be strange without you here," she said softly. Elias looked around the silent room, at the presses and the fume hood, at the tall shelves of archival boxes. "The work continues," he said. It was not a sad statement, but one of profound comfort. The work was larger than him. It had been there before him, and it would be there after him. He had simply been a faithful steward for a time. He left his old tools on the bench for her. He took only the new set his colleagues had given him. He walked out of the archive for the last time, the heavy door sighing shut behind him, the gentle hum of the climate control fading away. His retirement was as quiet and ordered as his working life. He spent his mornings in his small garden, tending to his plants with the same patient care he had once given to brittle paper. He read, he took long walks, and he continued his quiet pilgrimages to the places he had first encountered in the archives. Collection. He did not miss the work, because in a way, he had never left it. The mindset of the conservator, the gentle observation, the patient care, the deep respect for the integrity of things was now simply the way he moved through the world. One cool autumn afternoon, years later, he was sitting in his armchair, reading. The blue archival box was on the shelf, a quiet, unassuming presence. His great-aunt's story, and Thomas's, felt both distant and intimately close. He had lived a long, quiet, and solitary life, but he did not feel alone. His life had been a conversation with 1,000 other lives, 1,000 other quiet stories, whispered to him from the fragile pages he had held in his hands. He closed his eyes for a moment, the book resting in his lap. The house was silent. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering softly against the window pane. It was a sound of peace, of continuity. He had not signed charters or fought battles or built empires. He had simply spent his life mending paper. But in his quiet, meticulous, and deeply respectful work, Elias Vance had stitched together the past and the future, ensuring that the quiet whispers of history would not be lost to the indifferent silence of time. And it had been enough. It had been more than enough. The seasons continued their slow, unhurried turn, and Elias Vance moved through them with a gentle, accepting grace. His garden became his primary text, a living document that he learned to read and care for with the same focused attention he had once given to brittle paper. He learned the rhythm of the soil, the quiet language of the leaves, and the patient, helpful work of planting seeds for a future he might not see. The principles were the same. You could not force things, you could only create the right conditions for life to flourish. You provided support, you gently removed that which would cause harm, and you respected the inherent nature of the thing you were caring for. His correspondence with Isobel was a quiet, steady thread connecting him to his old life. Once every few months, a letter would arrive, her handwriting neat and familiar. She would tell him of the projects she was working on, the challenges of a water-damaged collection of theater playbills, the successful reinforcement of a fragile, oversized map. She would also include notes from his haptic register, adding her own observations about the feel of vellum or the scent of a particular kind of 19th century ink. The small catalogue was growing, a quiet, shared testament to their philosophy. One bright, crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived that was different. Isobel asked if she might visit him. She had a question, she wrote, not about a technical problem, but about a matter of conservation ethics, and she trusted his judgment more than anyone's. He wrote back a simple, welcoming reply. A week later, she arrived at his small house, carrying a flat, gray archival box. They sat in his living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air. Elias made tea, and they sat for a while in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of their shared professional lives needing no words. Finally, Isobel opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of archival tissue, was a small, cloth-bound diary from the late 1920s. It was not in terrible condition, but as she opened it, she showed Elias the issue. On several pages, the author, a woman, had clearly changed her mind about what she had written. She had not simply torn out the pages, she had obliterated the words, scribbling over them with thick, angry loops of the same black ink until the original text was an illegible, solid mass. The question, Isobel said softly, is what to do. There are imaging techniques now, infrared and multispectral imaging, that could probably let us read the words underneath. Some of the historians are very keen to try. They want to know what she was hiding. But I hesitate. She didn't want this to be read. She did this herself. Does our duty to history override our duty to her, to the creator of the document? Elias looked at the page for a long time. He saw the angry, deliberate act of erasure. He saw the passion and the pain that must have gone into it. The black, scribbled mass was not damage, in the way a water stain or a tear was damage. It was an intentional act. It was part of the diary's story. He did not answer immediately. He looked out the window at his garden, where the last of the autumn leaves were letting go of their branches. When we work, he began, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. We are always dealing with absences, the letters that were never sent, the documents that were lost to fire or flood, the stories that were never written down. The past is mostly silence. We are lucky to have the few whispers that remain. He looked back at the diary. This is not silence. This is a statement. This woman chose to make a part of her story silent. This black ink is as much a part of her narrative as the words she chose to leave. To try and see through it would be a violation. It would be like concealing a tomb that was meant to be left closed. He met Isobel's eyes. Our job, he said, is to conserve the object as it has come to us. And this object has come to us with its secrets intentionally kept. We should conserve the erasure. We should stabilize the paper so the ink doesn't corrode it further. But we should preserve her decision. That is also part of the history. Look of deep relief and understanding washed over Isobel's face. I thought so, she whispered. Thank you, Elias. They talked for a little while longer, about the archive, about his garden. When she left, Elias felt a quiet sense of peace. He had passed on the most important lesson, that their work was not about uncovering every secret, but about showing profound respect for the lives and the objects that had been entrusted to their care. The winter that followed was a quiet and gentle one. Elias spent his days indoors, reading, listening to the rain, and occasionally looking through the blue box that held Eleanor's story. He found he no longer thought of Thomas's tragic end with a sense of sorrow, but with a quiet sense of gratitude that the story, in its own small way, had survived and found its way to him. One evening, sitting in his armchair as the light faded outside, he felt a deep and profound sense of completion. His life had been a long, quiet line, a steady and unbroken thread. He had not sought fame or fortune or high adventure. He had sought only to do a simple, necessary thing, to care for the fragile things that time had left behind. He thought of the thousands of pieces of paper that had passed through his hands, each one a quiet life, a small story. He had been their temporary guardian, their physician, their quiet friend. He had mended their wounds and sheltered them, preparing them for a future he would not be a part of, and in doing so, he had found a purpose as deep and as solid as the foundations of the archive itself. The room grew dark. The house was silent. He did not get up to turn on a lamp. He simply sat, his hands resting on the worn arms of the chair, his breathing slow and even. He felt the gentle weight of his own years, not as a burden, but as a soft, comfortable blanket. The quiet work was done. His own story, like the documents he had cared for, had reached its final, peaceful state, and in the deep, enveloping stillness of his own history, Elias Vance was at rest.